I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 102 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, pursuant to Standing Order 1064, and the motion adopted by the committee on the 20th of November 2023. The committee is meeting to discuss a request to undertake a study of the recent comments from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change on the funding for road projects. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Is equipped with a sophisticated audio system. Feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite all participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table, away from the microphone when they are not in use. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly, and when you are not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. And given that the majority of members are joining us virtually today, I kindly ask for you to use the raised hand function when you would like to speak. The clerk and I will make note of that, and I will turn over the floor to you accordingly. To address the 1064 that was submitted to committee on February 16th, I'll open up the discussion by turning the floor over to Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee members and all of the staff for being here to assist us in this important work on behalf of Canadians. I note that there are 6 members that have signed this letter calling for this meeting because of the comments of Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of the Environment, last week, which have caused an uproar and uncertainty right across the country. His divisive comments, his extreme position has set off alarm bells in provincial capitals, in cities, in remote communities, and Indigenous communities right across the country, because it is a radical policy that he announced last week in Montreal, where he said, quote, "Our government has made the decision to stop investing in new road infrastructure." Now, if we break down that comment, you'll see quite clearly that this is not an off-the-cuff remark from a radical activist minister, even though he certainly has that background. He said that the government, our government, the Trudeau government, has made the decision to stop investing in new road infrastructure. Now, he went on to say that the, quote, "the analysis we have done is that the network is perfectly adequate to respond to the needs we have." Now, this is, again, an alarming point of view to have, and suggests that he hasn't spent much time traveling the country and speaking to Canadians who have significant concerns with our road network, who have both in terms of its current state and in terms of its current capacity. We know that there are supply chain issues. We've heard this time and time again about how reliant we are on for instance, the trucking sector to get our goods to market. And when you see these trucks sitting in traffic, whether it's around Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, or throughout the country, or traveling over roads that are quite frankly in a state of disrepair or unsafe, and in some cases unable to travel except in the winter because there's only an ice road, there is no permanent link between many of the communities in our country. The idea that the government has made the decision to stop investing in new road infrastructure, and that they've done an analysis that the network is perfectly adequate to respond to the needs we have, was shocking, as the letter said. So we believe that that this committee needs to discuss this matter on an urgent basis, And just to give you a heads up, Mr. Chair, I will be moving a motion at the end of my comments because I believe that we do need to hear from the minister and hear from other ministers who are impacted and who clearly were a part of this decision-making process. Because again, these were not comments where the minister was caught on a street corner by a lucky journalist who happened to find him while he was walking or riding his bike. These were comments that were given to a conference. These were prepared remarks by the Minister of the Environment designed to send a message to Canadians that I believe he said there'd be no more envelopes, meaning there'd be no more money for the road network in this country. And we've seen how these divisive comments have actually united Canadians against them. We've seen Northwest Territories Infrastructure Minister Caroline Wozniak said documents such as the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework are clear that there is a need to address transportation challenges in remote parts of Canada's north and the Arctic. Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan said the Trudeau government gets more out of touch with reality every day. Doug Ford, a great partner of this Liberal government, said, I'm gobsmacked. A federal minister said they won't invest in new roads or highways. He doesn't care that you're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic. Danielle Smith, anyone who thinks you can stop building roads obviously hasn't traveled outside of Montreal very much and doesn't understand how big this country is and doesn't understand what it takes to get to some of our resort communities. Blaine Higgs, the Trudeau government is unfairly punishing New Brunswickers for being rural. With our province experiencing historic population growth, this will be a roadblock to building new homes to tackle the housing crisis. Someone that the minister has tried to quote to justify the carbon tax, the food professor on Twitter, that's what he goes by. He said, Minister Guilbeault questioned any future major investment in infrastructure yesterday. Canada's logistics are anemic at best. Ports are horrible and roads are inefficient. If we want a stronger agri-food sector, logistics is the backbone of the industry. The mayor of Calgary said that the policy announced by Minister Guilbeault would literally be terrible for every municipality in this nation. And Premier David Eby of British Columbia said that the announcement made a lot of us very nervous. So this is a cross-section of Canadians, from everyone from the left to the right, who have been caught unawares and have been, quite frankly, shocked and in disbelief that this is the first government anytime, anywhere, I believe, that has indicated that they wouldn't be investing in roads. And then the minister tried to walk it back, which he failed to do. But after the government's policy was revealed and he had the opportunity to try to clarify, he said, no, I didn't mean we wouldn't, even though he said very clearly our government has made the decision to stop investing in new road infrastructure. He said, what I meant was we weren't going to invest in any big new road infrastructure, no more big projects. And he singled out the third line in Quebec City, and which I'm sure other colleagues will have something to say about. But I think about projects in my own area, a big project that is going to take multiple years and multiple billions of dollars will be to expand the Trans-Canada Highway from Langley to Abbotsford to Chilliwack with additional lanes. That's a major road project. And it's necessary because every day now there is bumper-to-bumper traffic on that major route, which connects Fraser Valley communities to Metro Vancouver communities, which connects workers to their jobs. As this government's policies have made it less and less affordable to live in cities, people have had to expand out into the suburbs. They've had to live further and further away from where they work in order to afford a home. This used to be the case that Chilliwack used to be an affordable market, but after 8 years of Justin Trudeau, now homes here are over $750,000 on average, with many 40-year-old homes cresting the $1 million mark. But people are still moving out further from the cities because even at those inflated prices, it's cheaper than living downtown or in closer proximity to Vancouver. Therefore, people need to drive to work. There is one bus that goes from Chilliwack into a bus route. It take you about 3 hours to get downtown if you just use the public transit options available. And the government of British Columbia has, over successive governments, have had an expansion program that they have had into the future. It's a phased program that will continue to build out from Metro Vancouver to the Fraser Valley. That is all at risk now because this Minister of the Environment, speaking for Justin Trudeau and the Cabinet, said that no more major road projects will be allowed to go ahead. So he's announcing basically that they are canceling the expansion of lanes for the Trans-Canada Highway. There are many other examples that I'm sure some colleagues will wish to speak to as we go forward tonight or today, maybe into tonight. We'll see how it goes. But we certainly believe that there is a necessity to hear from the minister himself so that he can explain this government's decision to stop investing in new road infrastructure, his words, and that he can explain to Canadians from small communities and large communities alike about why this decision by the Trudeau government has been taken. I found it very interesting to see in question period on Thursday members from multiple parties talking about the significant impact that this will have on Indigenous and Northern communities, how there are many communities that have been looking for permanent road access to bring down the cost of goods, to increase public safety, and to connect their communities with economic opportunities and other, connect their social networks as well. Right now, many of them are fly-in. Many of them have ice roads. And there are certainly, they would disagree with Minister Guilbeault's comments that the analysis we have done is that the network is perfectly adequate to respond to the needs we have. I don't know who the we is that he's talking about. Perhaps it's Liberals who live within 500 meters of a subway station. We certainly heard the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, made similar comments that she didn't need a car. She clearly did need a car. She just needed a taxpayer-funded car with a driver. Because we found out through public accounts that that was something that she did use. But she bragged about being able to use the subway to get everywhere. Minister Guilbeault is an avid cyclist, and that's great for him. But that's not the analysis we have done, is that the network is perfectly adequate to respond to the needs we have. Well, many Canadians have different needs than what the Liberals clearly have. They have a need to get their kids to school. They have a need to get their goods to market on a reliable road network. They have the need to get to work in a place that isn't right beside where they live. And so the government has started this war on people who need to drive their cars to live their lives. And this is particularly true when it comes to rural communities who don't have access to the same infrastructure that those who live in a downtown of a city like Minister Guilbeault have. So it's an out-of-touch comment. It's an offensive comment. It's an extreme policy, a ridiculous policy from a radical activist who has decided to, after being appointed by the Prime Minister, you look at this guy's record and it's almost impossible to believe that he was appointed to cabinet. This is a guy who had clambered up the CN Tower, who climbed onto the top of the roof of a sitting premier to protest and terrorize his family. And this is the guy who has been put in charge of our environment policies. No wonder that we have these kind of radical and extreme policies. So we think that we need to hear from him directly, as well as other members of this cabinet who came to the decision to stop investing in new road infrastructure. So I will read the motion that I will be moving into the record, and then we will get that to the clerk to distribute to everyone. But the motion is as follows: that the committee undertake a study of no less than 6 meetings on infrastructure in Canada and invite the following witnesses to appear before the committee. A, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change alone for 3 hours within 7 days of this motion being adopted. B, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities alone for 3 hours within 7 days of this motion being adopted. C, the Minister of Transport alone for 3 hours within 14 days of this motion being adopted. D, the Minister of Finance alone for 3 hours within 14 days of this motion being adopted. E, the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, Aaron Corey, alone for 3 hours within 14 days of this motion being adopted. F, any witnesses deemed relevant by committee members, and that the committee seek additional resources as required in order to accommodate these meetings, including by adding additional time to the end of meetings scheduled on accessible transportation for persons with disabilities, and by scheduling meetings during non-sitting days, and that, with the exception of scheduled meetings on accessible transportation for persons with disabilities, this study should take priority order. Now, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to speak to why we believe that this motion needs to be adopted by this committee. Obviously, we want to hear from the Minister of Environment, whose comments have created this firestorm across the country. We believe that he deserves to explain to Canadians the decision that was arrived at by the Trudeau government to no longer fund roads. Obviously, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities probably took a great interest in that, as the Minister of the Environment was sent out to make that announcement on his behalf. So we would like to see how that fits into the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities plan for infrastructure in this country. We believe that the Minister of Transport, that we have a direct interest in hearing from him to discuss the impact that this new policy of the Trudeau government will have on our ports, on our road infrastructure, on our supply chains. We believe that that is something that Minister Rodriguez should come before this committee to discuss. The Minister of Finance, I think, should discuss here how this is going to figure into the fiscal framework, the decision to abandon the funding of new roads. How does that impact the fiscal framework? How will that impact her budgeting process? We know that the budget is generally introduced in the spring. We would expect that they are putting the finishing touches on that, and perhaps she can tell us the impact that this new policy will have on the fiscal framework and the budget process. Obviously, the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank should be asked to discuss how this will impact the decisions of the bank. Of course, this committee has recommended previously in a report to the House that the Canada Infrastructure Bank be disbanded, but the government has maintained the bank despite its many problems. But we would like to hear from the Canada Infrastructure Bank to see how this no new major roads policy will impact their ability to make decisions and investment decisions, and whether they have hired any high-priced consultants to advise them on this new decision, as they did previously with other failed projects. And there are any other witnesses deemed relevant by committee members. I can think of provincial and territorial and community and Indigenous leaders who probably would like to weigh in on this as well. We want to make sure that we continue the work that we are doing with the Accessible Transportation for Persons with Disabilities study, which is an important study. We don't want to take away from that, but we believe that we can do two things at once. We can have concurrent studies going on, and that this important issue of road infrastructure can be discussed outside of the normal committee times, either by adding hours to those meetings or by adding additional meetings, so that we can have these questions, have these ministers appear and have them answer questions as soon as possible. So I've moved that motion, and I would be happy to have my committee colleagues weigh in on when they would like to hear from the Minister of the Environment and how we should structure those hearings. So I appreciate the time, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strahl. This is the list we have so far for a speaking list. We have Mr. Biddle up next, Ms. Landsman up, Mr. Muse, followed by Mr. Badaway, suivi par Mr. Gould, suivi par Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Before we get to the speakers list, however, the clerk has informed me that we do need to suspend temporarily for her to be able to verify that the motion is duly translated in both official languages, and that the spirit of the motion, the wording, is exactly the same in both languages. So for that, I will suspend for 5 minutes, and we will resume once all members have received the motion in both official languages. The meeting stands suspended. To order. Just to remind colleagues, the speaking order is Mr. Biddle, followed by Ms. Landsman, followed by Mr. Muse, followed by Mr. Badaway, followed by Mr. Gould, Mr. Basse-Duval, Ms. Murray, as well as Mr. Backrack. Mr. Biddle, you are up next. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm not surprised the Conservatives have brought this forward. I guess I'm very surprised that the NDP and Bloc have supported this feigned outrage by the Conservative Party. We saw immediately that the Minister of the Environment clarified his statements with respect to this. This is not a change in government policy. This has been a government that has provided historic investments in infrastructure, all the while Conservatives voting against. The main agricultural policy of the Conservative Party is rage farming, so this seems to be along those lines. So I'm happy to take members through what we've been engaged with since 2015. In terms of making investments in communities and making Canada a better place to live, whether it's rural, urban, northern, and that includes investments in highways, roads, bridges, and nothing's changed. That's been confirmed by the minister. It's been confirmed, I believe, by the Prime Minister in question period. And I can appreciate the opposition wanting to try to squeeze some news out of nothing during a break week, but here we are. And give one example, the Canada Community Building Fund. Our government has invested $3.3 billion, that's billion with a B, in 8,000 highway, road, bridge projects across the country. 8,000 highway, road, and bridge project. On top of that, $850 million for nearly 450 road and highway projects across the country through the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, also known as ISIP. It's strange that the Conservatives want to call attention to infrastructure because the only party leader in this country who's calling for cuts to infrastructure is Pierre Poilievre. He's committed to blocking infrastructure funding to cities, despite the need for greater infrastructure funding to get housing built. And we believe in developing infrastructure that's key to not only a lot of what Mr. Strahl talked about, but also around the housing crisis. We're not going to get more houses built unless we build more infrastructure. But what we saw and what we've seen is Conservative Party vote against it time after time after time. And it's interesting that Monsieur Gourde is here. I believe he was the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Public Works during his time in government. And he can speak firsthand to starving municipalities of money and the consequences that that entails. So I'm glad he's here. I'm sure he'll speak to that later. As I've said, our position on infrastructure has been clear since our election in 2015. There's been no change in government policy. We're making historic investments across the country. Again, I can appreciate trying to drum up some outrage, trying to send out some fundraising emails during a constituency week, trying to get a little bit of media attention. It's what I guess a good opposition does to try to get some attention, but this is much ado about nothing. Especially in relation to the minister's comments with respect to the third link in Quebec. This is something that he's been saying for over a year in French, but he says it in English, and we're all outraged, and maybe we should all take more French lessons. And appreciate that this is a country in both official languages. I don't know why the opposition is so outraged only when it's said in English, but not in French. So that's disappointing. Well, I guess I can speak a little bit to road and highway investments in Quebec, now that we're talking about it. Through the new Building Canada Fund, we've helped fund major highway projects in support of trade and transportation priorities, including Phase 3 of Route 85, which is improving transportation between Quebec and Atlantic Canada, Phase 3 of the extension of Route 35 to the American border, and the extension of Route 138 on the lower North Shore. We've also funded major road and bridge projects to help improve public transit and make for greener and more sustainable urban transportation. This includes the extension of Autoroute 19 in Laval and the reconstruction of Point P 9, which support an efficient, modern bus rapid transit system in a rapidly growing region. And Mr. Strahl talked about lack of municipal bus services in his part of the world. That's something that we've stood up and funded as well in terms of infrastructure. It's not just a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of we need to build roads. We need to be focused on many different levels and many different points of infrastructure, which we've been doing. And we will continue to make the necessary investments in road transportation, create jobs, reduce pollution, improve our communities, and make our communities more resilient against the risks of climate change. And I appreciate the Mr. Strahl bringing out all the conservative talking points about Stephen Guilbeault. I especially liked him bringing up the climbing of the CN Tower. I don't know why that upsets conservatives so much. Maybe it's because most members of parliament can barely climb a ladder. To see a minister be able to climb the CN Tower is rather impressive and something to be jealous of, but something they always go back to. I don't know if this is all in a place of climate change denialism, and this is what it's coming to, trying to gain outrage through that. See it time and time again. That being said, there's been no change in policy, and I'll keep coming back to that. Moving along a bit, if I can, in terms of the GTHA. In Ontario, we've been providing funding directly to municipalities, and we invested $2.1 billion, that's billion with a B, in 2,900 road and bridge projects. I know Mr. Strahl mentioned the North, and that's a significant concern. I believe he was Parliamentary Secretary to Northern Affairs, again, when that previous government was starving provinces and municipalities of infrastructure funding. So again, he's a good one to speak to. But we understand the North has very specific needs, and Mr. Strahl brought some of those up. And we've invested another $3 billion in 11,000 projects across the territory since 2019. And a few, if I can mention, $16 million for 21 road, bridge, and highway projects in the Northwest Territories, $5.5 million for 25 road, bridge, and highway projects in the Yukon, and $3.7 million for 11 road, bridge, and highway projects in Nunavut. And we'll keep working with provinces. This is something that we've been doing. Mr. Strahl mentioned working with Premier Ford. We'll work with whomever wants to work with us. This is fundamentally important, whether it's supply chains, whether it's climate adaptability. I know that's not necessarily something the Conservatives want to talk about. Mr. Strahl did briefly mention buses, as I hope he meant it in an important part of getting people around in his community and the need for greater funding. But again, we've invested historic amounts in buses. I guess I'll go through some more of the highlights, if you will, before I get into some more details. In Newfoundland and Labrador, because I believe Mr. Strahl mentioned the Trans-Canada Highway. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we invested $153 million in the enhancement of the Trans-Canada Highway, which includes twinning of the highway. In Nova Scotia, $90 million to twin Highway 104. Mr. Strahl mentioned New Brunswick. We invested $180 million in Route 11 twinning project. Prince Edward Island, $21.4 million to improve roads in Prince Edward Island. Another highlight, $37 million in Ontario to expand Highway 11 and 17 to the township of Dorian. $46 million for the expansion of Highway 404, that's in the Toronto area, by constructing HOV lanes, which again is an important item if you're dealing with traffic in the Greater Toronto area. I know I don't live anywhere near a subway, Mr. Strahl, but this is important to help move people through the GTA. Alberta, the Southwest Calgary Ring Road project, $1/3 of $1 billion, $333.6 million. In Manitoba, the National Highway System, PTH1 West, it's Trans-Canada Highway, $40 million. British Columbia, I know Mr. Strahl mentioned his part of the world, $1 million for the 100-mile House Horse Lake Road Bridge replacement. And if we look at road and infrastructure projects, I'll go through some of them. In Alberta, 863 road projects, road bridge infrastructure projects, $480 million. British Columbia, again, Mr. Strahl worried about British Columbia, not to worry, 736 projects, almost $223 million. In Manitoba, 563 projects, $170 million. In New Brunswick, 143 projects, $68 million. Newfoundland and Labrador, 391 projects, for nearly $50 million. Nova Scotia, 308 projects, nearly $91 million. Northwest Territories, 20 highway road infrastructure projects, $5.5 million. Nunavut, 11 projects for $3.7 million. Ontario, which I've mentioned, and a proud Ontario member of Parliament, almost 3,900 projects, $2 billion. $2 billion. It's very clear that there's no policy change, and this is a government that gets roads, highways, bridges built and understands the importance of that infrastructure. Prince Edward Island, 82 projects, almost 41 million. Saskatchewan, 769 projects for $122 million. Yukon, 25 projects, $5.4 million. And again, this is where I got the number from before, nearly 8,000 projects, $3.3 billion. And to suggest this government does not care about the needs of municipalities and the concerns of infrastructure deficits across the country, this is clearly proof to the opposite. And it's been confirmed, and I'll probably have to keep repeating myself because I don't think the Conservatives will take the answer. But there's been no change in policy. But I guess I'll go through some of the, because this is quite the rich record in terms of what's been done and our partnerships both municipally and provincially in terms of what we're getting done. So I'll highlight some of the, specifically we'll go down to city level in terms of what we've been doing. Again, Mr. Strahl bringing up New Brunswick, City of Dieppe, the Dieppe Boulevard extension. It's a $21 million investment from the federal government. In Newfoundland and Labrador, Bishops Falls, Chance Cove, Grand Falls, Windsor, enhancements to the Trans-Canada Highway, which I mentioned, Route 1, $153 million. In Nova Scotia, Truro, town of Truro, McClure's Mills Road and Willow Street Roundabout, $1.1 million. Back to Newfoundland, Labrador, Mount Pearl, Municipality of St. John's, completion of Route 3, $15 million. Saskatchewan, I have a few from Saskatchewan. Municipality of Torch River. This is the construction of a bridge south of Garrick. It's a federal investment of $166,000. Municipality of Lumsden. We have a few from Lumsden. One is the Shirley Andrew Low level crossing, $50,000. Another level crossing at Fish Farm low level crossing, another $50,000. And a third project in Lumsden is a cement bridge, $166,700. The Municipality of Keys, Red Bin Road Bridge, $83,350. Again, they're not all billion-dollar, million-dollar projects. We're there with small municipalities as well to get these projects done. And again, there's been no change. We got to keep working. We got to keep moving forward on this. Still in Saskatchewan, the town of Priestville, $166,000 for a bridge, the Ebel Bridge. Municipality of Porcupine, the Reed Bridge, $166,000. In Caledonia, the Crystal Concrete Arch, $166,000. In Mervyn, Saskatchewan, bridge at Township Road 502, another $166,000. Municipality of Orkney, Township Road 275, another $166,000. Municipality of Canwood, the Deep Lake Bridge,
$83,350. Municipality of Hudson Bay. This is a bridge replacement, another $166,000. The municipality of Murray Creek, it's the Green Bridge replacement for $134,000. Municipality of Laurier, still in Saskatchewan. The Martin Bridge replacement, $166,000. Back to Ornke, the Jebber Grid Bridge, $57,000. Town of Priestville, the Scheller Bridge, $75,000. And again, Conservatives voting against all of these, be it in various budgets across the board or in our vote-a-thon in December voting against infrastructure funding. It's quite ironic to see them vote against it and then be mad at our infrastructure spending, which again is historic. Poplar Valley in Saskatchewan, the Wolf Bridge replacement, $50,000. Municipality of Bigger, the Palo Bridge replacement, $85,000. Loon Lake, Saskatchewan, another bridge replacement, $166,000. The municipality of Big Stick, this is a Big Stick bridge replacement, $161,000. Village of Meota, the Iffley Bridge replacement, $75,000. Wellington, Saskatchewan. This is Southwest Bridge replacement, another $166,000. On to Prince Edward Island, Warren Grove, $1.2 million for roads and highways. Newfoundland and Labrador, Gambo, Pine Tree Roads upgrade, $460,000. Mount Pleasant in Saskatchewan, North Bridge replacement, another $166,000. Flett Springs in Saskatchewan, and again, $166,000 for a bridge replacement. And I have more, and I'm willing to come back to more, but I would like to even bring up Minister Guilbeault's own portfolio, which is Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the Conservatives starved Parks Canada of funding through their years. And so I'll just go through briefly some of the projects that ECCC, or Environment and Climate Change Canada, have brought forward in terms of roads there. And it's important in terms of getting people through for the tourism, through so people can see these great national parks. So Terra Nova National Park in Newfoundland, $45.6 million. Grossmorn, and I had the fortune of visiting this last year. It's great work, and I highly recommend everyone visit Grossmorn. It is quite beautiful, probably one of the most beautiful places in the country. $21.7 million. Fundy National Park, $19 million. La Maurice National Park, $53 million. Reading Mountain National Park, $36.2 million. Jasper and Banff National Parks. I know Mr. Strahl brought up Alberta and getting people to these areas. $36 million. Or excuse me, Banff and Jasper is $120 million. Sorry, don't want to be misquoted on that. And that's a project that's ongoing. That's work being done right now as we speak in the minister's own department. Yoho National Park, British Columbia, $67.5 million for Trans-Canada twinning. Again, that's work that's ongoing, workers working right now. There's no change in policy. Glacier National Park, $141 million. Again, that's work that's ongoing in British Columbia. I know Mr. Sproul's worried, but he doesn't have to. No change in policy. This work will continue. And Wood Buffalo National Park, $28.2 million. And these are all projects in the Minister Guilbeault's portfolio. This is work being done. This is important work. I have a lot more to go through because these are historic investments in infrastructure across the country. Again, which Conservatives have voted against and have promised to cut as they go to war with municipalities. So I'm happy to come back to this. I'd like to hear what others have to say, including those MPs who are there for starving municipalities of road and bridge funding, one of whom has their hand up right now. So I would like to hear from them. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and if I could be put back on the list at the end, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle. It is indeed noted. Next, we'll turn it over to Ms. Landsman. Ms. Landsman, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and I'm sure that the voters of St. Catharines will have better days ahead instead of listening to that diatribe. But on the motion, on the actual substance of it, it seems that the Prime Minister's environment minister, radical environment minister, has announced an infrastructure plan. More soul-sucking traffic, more gridlock. And anyone who is driven through the GTA has come to expect that highways are gridlocked, they'll sit in traffic, missing productive time, missing time with their families. And it's the Liberals' radical environment minister who only wants to see this get worse. Not only that, we have a deputy prime minister who's just as out of touch. When she isn't being driven around by taxpayer-funded chauffeurs, she lives in a world that is separate from the reality of most Canadians, and frankly, from the reality of almost anybody on this meeting, on this call. So bragging that, I don't own a car, that's a direct quote. I'm like, I don't know, 300 meters from the nearest subway, I walk and I take the subway. Here's the problem, though. Not all Canadians live on a subway line, and Canadians already send their tax dollars to Ottawa for road infrastructure. So when we have an environment minister who announces a new policy, then it's incumbent on a committee to study that and at least call the environment minister. That's exactly why we're calling the environment minister and his colleagues to appear before this transportation committee and to hold them accountable for the extreme and reckless policy positions that he has put forward. And in case the committee doesn't recall, like the member from St. Catharines, Mr. Biddle, was proud to run a victory lap, it is his history of activism that in 2001 had him arrested and charged with mischief for scaling the CN Tower as part of a Greenpeace stunt. And I know that 2001 is long ago, but even in 2019, in an interview, he said, in many ways, you were still the guy who climbed the CN Tower. Those are his words. I am still the guy who climbed the CN Tower. So after 2.5 years of his tenure as Liberal Environment Minister, there is no doubt that that statement was true. He has proven himself to Canadians to be a radical, far-left Greenpeace activist that he has described himself to be. And his actions as Environment Minister haven't made any constructive change or positive steps towards protecting the environment, balanced with the reality that Canadians face to navigate the high interest rates driven by deficits and inflation, and of course the carbon tax that this government continues to impose on everyday Canadians. Rather, he has sought to divide, virtue signal, and implement an extremist agenda at each point of his tenure. He has doubled down on the punishing carbon tax that certainly doesn't work and that floods the government coffers with hundreds of millions of dollars, that makes Canadians poorer and not richer. He's got an effective ban on fossil fuel development at a time where Canadians, and frankly the world, needs our natural resources more than ever. And the latest, announcing that the Government of Canada will no longer build any roads that connect our communities, that drive economic prosperity for millions across the country, and frankly are the only way to get goods and people and everything else from one place to another where they are not 300 meters from a subway or have the transportation networks that are required. We've got broken ports in this country. Frankly, ports that come up as last on any list of efficiency of getting goods into the country. We have a road system that if you ask anybody who sits in traffic anywhere in the GTA, in Greater Vancouver, in Montreal, in Ottawa, why they're sitting in their cars for hours at a time, if you ask them if our road system is effective, they will surely tell you no. And so to see this environment minister, this radical activist environment minister, tell Canadians from coast to coast, tell premiers and tell mayors that they're no longer funding roads, I think this committee ought to hear directly from him. I think that he needs to answer to Canadians. That's exactly why we've brought this motion here today. And that's exactly why we want to hear from him and his colleagues about the direction of this government rather than a laundry list of how government policy hasn't changed despite the fact that the government has announced a change in policy. You heard it directly from the words of the environment minister. So rather than playing defense for the radical environment minister, I think the Canadians ought to hear him at this committee. So bringing it back to the motion rather than the diatribe we heard from the member from St. Catharines, Mr. Biddle, I think that we should refocus this discussion on bringing the government's environment minister and his colleagues to committee to answer to Canadians on why they want to stop construction of roads, why they want to continue with their radical agenda of environment policy, which is going to quadruple the carbon tax and stop people from driving their cars, transferring their goods, and seeing one another. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Landsman. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to amplify the comments of my colleagues and particularly Ms. Landsman. We've put forward this motion because, in fact, these comments from the radical environment minister of this government have caused that uproar and caused that uncertainty. And we've heard that from, and certainly in my home province of Ontario, the Premier and the Minister of Transportation, but we've heard that from mayors and provincial and municipal counterparts across the country. The comment that the road network we have now is perfectly adequate to serve the needs we have is absolutely incorrect and alarming. In fact, the fact that it was given at a prepared remarks at a conference would indicate that is the new policy of the Liberal government, and so that is cause for concern. That is why we put forward this motion so that we can hear directly from the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change himself, but also the Ministers of Infrastructure, Transport, and Finance Minister, who obviously are party to this, the whole funding of infrastructure and road infrastructure across Canada. And I stood yesterday on a bridge overpass on the 403 near Hamilton, my home here. And the 403, of course, is a major artery through the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And in fact, the bridge that I stood on was one of the the rehabilitation of bridges funded as part of the infrastructure program under the previous Conservative government. And of course, I watched the gridlock, the lineup of trucks that were on the 403, and that particular infrastructure funding for the 403 rehabilitation and those bridges at that time, following the years of the Great Recession under the previous Stephen Harper Conservative government, in fact, was actually 2/3 funded by the federal government, because the Liberal provincial government of the day did not have the funds to actually contribute their share to that particular project. So we're talking about 400 series highways in southern Ontario around the GTHA that are critical to the movement of people and the movement of goods. So we want to talk about supply chains. We want to talk about ports, which is an area of responsibility of this committee that we spent some time studying. I was at an announcement at the Hamilton Oshawa Port Authority in Hamilton in January, and they're of course doing incredible work. And with this announcement, with a sugar company, they're going to actually build Canada's largest sugar refinery right at the Port of Hamilton. But talk about multimodal. We've got a port. They now have a rail link connecting to Montreal, which was announced as well by CN. But we've also got the fastest growing cargo airport in the country in Hamilton. But we also have that critical piece of infrastructure, and that is the road and highway network to get those goods, because Ontario is a food and beverage manufacturing center, and so this needs to supply that. But that sugar needs to get from the port to the food and beverage manufacturers in Hamilton and across the GTA. So this is good business, but it's also people here stuck in traffic and that frustration every day. And so whether we think about things like the 403, whether we think about the proposed Highway 413 by the Ontario government, or we think about the Highway 401, which is a critical and of course noted as the busiest highway and most congested highway in the world, critical to our trade corridors, but also critical to movement of people. And so again, I would suggest that we get back to the business at hand, which is the motion that's been put forward by my colleague, Mr. Strahl. And so let's move forward so we can hear directly from the ministers as to what this new policy entails. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muse. Next, prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Gould.
Next up, we have Mr. Gould. Mr. Gould, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy to be joining your committee today to speak to the matter at hand and just express that to what degree the new policies of the Liberal government announced by the radical Minister of Environment impacted my region. So the region of Montreal, Lévis, and Quebec is the second most important economic region in Quebec, and this region has two highways in the south, Highway 20 that connects to Highway 40, and we have the north-south highway as well that goes all the way to the United States, going through the Lac-Saint-Jean region. So it's a very major hub. And when we hear that there will no more be any large-scale road projects, that is of concern for us, especially the troisième lien that was referenced, which is very important for the greater region of Quebec City. Population is going up in this part of the province, and there's a great potential that in the next 20 years it might even double the population, because there's still affordable construction and land available here. So there is a growth of the population, which will inevitably mean an increase in road traffic. Having said that, the government of Quebec asked the Caisse de dépôt, the infrastructure division, to carry out a study to see the possibility of having a third connection, the troisième lien. And the Minister Guilbeault's comments will probably go into the report that will be submitted to the government of Quebec in June. And this is a major issue, because signals are being sent that in the future there won't be a federal government who will support these great road projects and infrastructure projects, and this could have an impact on the decision to be made or the opinion to be issued by the Caisse de dépôt. So this might have very negative ramifications for my region and for Quebec in general, indirectly. So Mr. Guilbeault's vision is a vision that is set in stone by his government. Even the Prime Minister said in the House that there won't be a troisième lien. And the Minister Guilbeault has already said that a favorable environmental study from the Ministry of Environment, the Department of Environment of Canada, because there will be a study, because a river crossing entails federal jurisdiction. He said that this wouldn't be accepted by himself as long as he was the Minister of Environment. So when you bring all of these elements together, it might have a negative impact on this report to be issued to the government of Quebec and indefinitely delay a project that is key for the economic development of the National Capital Region and for the city of Quebec, Lévis, and the Chaudière-Appalaches region as well. So over the long term, this would have negative ramifications. We currently have 2 bridges that are in need of major repair, and lanes will have to be shut on a regular basis to carry out this repair work. And even with these 2 bridges, at the moment, we have a maximum capacity of about 140,000 vehicles daily, and our needs will probably be around 250,000 in a number of years. So building a bridge, of course, takes between 3 and 7 years. So it is, I think, clear that the project, the Troisième Lien, is highly anticipated, and we're looking at 2030, 2032. So it's very important to make the right decisions today and send the right signals that a responsible government will be there for great road projects for the future of our country and for the future of the province, our province of Quebec. So having said that, I am not going to delay the working of the committee. I am in support, of course, in favor of the motion by my colleague, Mr. Stroll. So the federal government, the Liberal government, doesn't really seem to be following a direction that we would like to see, and we cannot really manage a country in the same way you're managing a large city. Our country is very vast, and transport will continue to be very, very important on our great country for dozens of years, decades to come. So when you come forward with policies, we have to think about the future of our country, and if we want a better future, we have to be able to have the transportation options available to us. And with that, I'd like to yield the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gourde. And next up, we have Mr. Bassoro Duval. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank my colleagues for being here with us today. So I would like to expand a little bit on why I decided to support the idea of having a meeting today, because the intention here is to talk about the comments of the Ministry of Environment on road projects. And he was saying almost that the federal government will not be spending any money on these projects. So having heard those comments, I was really surprised, and really surprised in the sense that it doesn't appear to be a government policy, a responsible government policy. This could be a militant vision of someone who comes from a certain ideology, who says that, okay, I will say something that will be shocking to people. But when you're in government, you are supposed to be responsible and make decisions for all of the country, and that can be turned into concrete projects. So it's concerning, because when it comes to road transportation, the reality of the matter is that our road network isn't even finished. We have a vast country. Many people refer to that. And in Quebec, there are many cities and villages in the north or east of the province of Quebec which aren't connected by major roads. So as you can imagine, there are people in these regions who have a hard time hearing these comments, because if you don't have a major road where you live and the government says that, well, there won't be any more investments, well, that means your village will not be connected ever. So there is the road, the Highway 138, which has this very aim and intention. But if you tell these people that they will never have a road, they will be disappointed. And people in the North Coast, an important project for them, for instance, is the implementation of a bridge over the Saguenay, because people are constantly having to use different kinds of vessels to go to this part of the province. And sometimes they end up waiting for hours and hours to be able to get on a vessel, because there is no bridge. And a vessel, of course, has a certain capacity. So in Quebec, Well, there's the Highway 50, because we're here in Ottawa. It's not doubled, so it's called a highway, but it's just a road. It's not a divided highway, and it can be dangerous in winter, for instance, when you have reduced visibility. There is the risk of head-on collisions, of course, and when conditions are not great, then traffic slows down. So there's a safety element to this. I only refer to a couple projects. Of course, there might be others which might be of importance for Quebec in the future. Therefore, having a government vision to say that while the priority isn't road infrastructures and we have a road network that is sufficiently developed, to be able to say that we need to prioritize public transit projects, if the government were to say that, that would be a responsible policy. And I think that is the sort of vision that we need to have in order to reduce the impact of climate change and to prevent urban sprawling. That is an important issue as well. So, yes, there is a vision in all of this, which could have been displayed more intelligently based on principles and values, and in a more considerate way. So I think it is important to have the minister appear before our committee just to understand whether he said this off the cuff and he wasn't really thinking, or if this is the real policy of the government, which would be concerning. It's also important that other ministers come to our committee to talk to us. It's not just the Minister of Environment who invests in these projects. You have the Minister of Transportation, Minister of Infrastructure, so it might be relevant for them to come here and explain themselves and just to see what kind of a vision the government has and what they're aiming to do in their departments. I also would like to add that the good news, regardless of the government's orientations, and it will be, of course, interesting to understand. But in general, it's not Ottawa that decides on road projects. The majority of these projects, whether it is in different municipalities or different cities, it's the cities themselves who finance these projects. And when you look at the great highway connections across Quebec, while most of the time it's first Quebec, the province, who authorize and then finance these projects. So does Ottawa have a role to play? Sometimes. Some projects are partly financed by Ottawa, but first and foremost, it's Quebec's and municipalities' jurisdiction. So at the end of the day, if Ottawa decides not to finance these projects, we could still survive that decision, even though that's not really desirable, because people in far-off regions, they pay taxes to the federal government. So whoever lives in these places far away from the bigger centers, of course, they would be disappointed to see that the federal government, while they're paying taxes to the federal government, made the decision to just let them to their fate and not bring the road network to them. So I think these were irresponsible words from the minister, and he should come here and explain himself. So words like this that were expressed by the minister also explain why the Liberals do not really have that many MPs in some of these regions. Maybe they should go and talk to these people to understand their reality. So rather than spending hours or speculating on what the minister said or what he actually meant and what the government has in terms of their position, I think the best thing to do would be to look at the motion that's before us, that's on the table, and to end up with something that's concrete. The Conservatives wanted to put on a show, but it's also a good motion in the sense that the minister should come and explain himself. But rather than parading half the cabinet here, it might be a better idea to really have a tighter framework and then to see if we need an extended study on the subject. So what I would therefore suggest when it comes to the motion of our colleague is that we modify it so that we have one meeting, a single meeting, and we'll have the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Housing, the Minister of Transport who will be there, and our clerk, I think, did a very good job of putting my amendment on paper. So It would read with the amendment, the committee undertake a study, just a study on infrastructure in Canada and invite the following witnesses to appear before the committee. And we can also add within the 30 days following the adoption of this motion. So A, as is already the case in the motion, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, but not the rest. B, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. Again, we can strike the rest of the sentence. And then C, the Minister of Transport, striking the rest. So when it comes to D, E, and F, I recommend that we strike these, as well as the following paragraph on the hours and the resources to be dedicated, because if we have only one meeting, then we don't really need to make a lot of changes to our agenda and House resources. So I hope that my amendment to the motion is clear, and I hope also that members of the committee will accept it, so that we can have the minister and representatives of the government, so that they can explain their real position to us, and hopefully we will receive reasonable explanations from them. Thank you, Mr. Barcelo-Duval. Our clerk will distribute the proposed amendment.
Okay, and fully understand the amendment that was put forward by Mr. Barcelo-Duval. Okay, I see thumbs up. Okay, next on the speakers list, and now we will begin the discussion on the amendment proposed by Mr. Barcelo-Duval. We have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Barcelo-Duval, for the amendment. I'm going to speak generally to the topic at hand, and I'll circle back to the amendment near the end. I think part of the issue here is that the minister did very clearly say that there's been a policy change. Mr. Biddle, on the other hand, at this meeting has said there has been no policy change, and so the committee deserves to know which of those two things is true. And I think bringing the ministers to committee to elaborate on that apparent contradiction is a useful exercise, certainly in the public interest. Now, I know there were a lot of people across Canada, including the ministers that my colleagues have highlighted, who were surprised by the words of the Environment Minister. Here in Northwest BC, there are a lot of remote communities that have challenges with road infrastructure, and they want the federal and provincial governments to work together to ensure that they have safe and reliable road access to their communities, not just for the everyday needs of travel to larger centers, but in the cases of emergency. We've seen wildfires, we've seen very serious weather events that have required communities to leave suddenly, and having good road infrastructure is vital in that regard. I'm thinking about Highway 51. This is the road to Telegraph Creek. It has suffered serious damage in the wake of the fires of 2018. The provincial government has put extensive money into that road, but it still requires additional work. And I note that they have made commitments to continue that work. And the question, of course, is what the role for the federal government may be in that partnership. I'm here today in Fort St. James, and the road to the community of Takla Landing is an issue of urgent concern for that community. Folks in Takla rely on a Forest Service road, a resource road that is mostly maintained by the forest companies that conduct activities in the area. And when those activities turn downward, often the maintenance goes with it. And there's no really consistent plan to upgrade the road to the standard that is required for the community as its primary access. So they've highlighted their needs, and they would very much like for the provincial and federal governments to come up with a plan to upgrade that road so that they can more easily and more safely access nearby communities. Of course, my colleague in northern Manitoba has highlighted the need for all-weather roads in that region. And altogether, the Assembly of First Nations has estimated the infrastructure gap when it comes to all-seasons roads is around $35 billion. Now, the lack of, or the loss of ice roads, rather, is a direct result of climate change. And so, we need to invest in this all-weather infrastructure as part of our response to adapting to the extreme weather that we're experiencing more and more. I think, if anything, the minister's comments show a lack of due attention to the needs of rural and remote Canada. And it shows a sort of urban myopia that ignores many of the real needs of rural communities. But when it comes to urban Canada, and like it or not, Canada is an increasingly urbanized country, it's simply a reality that we need to do things differently than we have in the past as a country. And so there are a number of questions that I think are very apt and would be useful to ask as part of a study. I won't get into great depth, but financial resources are limited, and we need to have solid plans for how to get people where they need to go and efficiently use public resources to invest in infrastructure that does that, at the same time driving down greenhouse gas emissions and tackling climate change. I note that in my province of British Columbia, the provincial government has a target to reduce light vehicle kilometers traveled by 25% by 2030. And a big part of that is the investment in transit, which is something that the environment minister mentioned. And yet, this government's permanent public transit fund isn't going to start until 2026. And we've heard very clearly from municipalities that not only is the gap between 2024 and 2026 unacceptable, but that the size of the permanent public transit fund is insufficient given the massive need for infrastructure investment and the escalation in construction costs that communities are facing. So there are very important questions that we have to ask, that if indeed the government's policy is to invest less in highways and freeways and more in public transit in order to get people where they need to go, whether the magnitude of the investments they're willing to commit to are adequate to achieve that. Because the reality is that the people who live in the suburbs that Mr. Strahl identified do need to get to work. And they can't afford to live in the centers of our big cities where housing is simply unaffordable. So these are questions I think that the committee could grapple with as part of a study, as part of a meeting with the ministers. And I think it's something that is in the public interest for us to get to the bottom of. Along with that, and I mentioned the all-weather roads, but we have a larger question about our highway infrastructure and its resilience in the face of climate change. And we saw just last year, I believe, it was when we saw the atmospheric rivers in the lower mainland of British Columbia tear out a huge amount of transportation infrastructure. And so understanding whether we're investing enough as a country in the resilience of the existing infrastructure is an issue of urgent concern. So I think that the proposal that Mr. Barcelou-Duval has brought forward, that the committee have a meeting with the appearance of several ministers in order for us to scope out what a more comprehensive study might look like. I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. I have heard at previous meetings my conservative colleagues insist that this committee's practice in the past has been that we have a fairly orderly approach to how we approach studies, and that each party has had the ability to bring forward studies in due course and have those completed. I would note that the committee is currently studying both the issue of high-frequency rail and the issue of the accessibility of air travel in Canada. My hope that would be that before we embark on a more in-depth study on highway and road infrastructure in Canada, that we would complete those studies as has been this committee's practice. But I am willing to support the amendment, which would see a more timely meeting on this particular topic with the three ministers appearing, as Mr. Barcelou-Duval has outlined. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Just to remind colleagues, the speaking order is Mr. Badaway, Ms. Murray, Mr. Biddle, Mr. Strahl, Mr. Muse. And next up, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. Mr. Chair, I will be supporting the motion that Mr. Barcelou-Duval has put on the floor. And I do want to speak a bit, as I have the floor, about the integration of our multimodal networks across the country. But I have to say this from the onset, is that it's all, as we move forward with planning, we have to recognize that we have to have a sound planning process in place to actually embark on the investments, the capital investments that we're going to make. And what I mean by that, Mr. Chairman, is it's no different than a community's strategic plan. And then from there, the next layer is establishing official plan, what goes where. And then thirdly is establishing the secondary plan to ensure that the capacity that's needed within the official plan is met. And obviously, the last part is who's going to pay for it, and where's that money going to come from, whether it comes from development charges, whether it comes from different levels of government or even the private sector, in terms of leveraging that funding would be appropriate. And that would be a direction that any local level of government would embark on with the help of other levels of government in the private sector. A perfect example of that is here in my riding. In the city of Welland, when we had a roadway, a historic traditional roadway that actually connected part of the city of Welland from the east to the west in Dane City. We had a bridge go down that was once federally owned along the old canal, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Welland Canal. That bridge going down, we were then having to, again, under the official plan with growth happening there, quite a bit of growth, I might add, it identified new housing being built. Under the secondary planning, it obviously identified the water, the sewer, but as well the road network that would have to be maintained. With the bridge gone, it obviously wasn't going to be maintained, so therefore the city embarked on working with myself and many others, including the private sector, I might add, to reestablish the bridge, and of course, with that, as I said earlier, the need to finance it. They were successful at working with myself as well as others in the private sector, the developer that was going to be adding growth to that part of the city. We were able to bring in from the federal level of government $2.6 million to leverage the money of the city and the private sector. So just an example of how the federal government works within or to strengthen our transportation networks. But I have to say that, one, it was based on good, solid planning. And two, of course, an approach that I might add the Conservatives don't always nurture, an approach that actually works with everybody, all levels of government, and of course, the private sector. You know, and Mr. Muse sort of touched on it a bit, and I want to touch on it a bit deeper because I'm very intimately involved in the establishment of a very solid multimodal network here in Southern Ontario. Niagara's flagship economy depends on that network and is continuing to work with stakeholders, partners to strengthen that network. You know, Niagara is Canada's canal corridor region with the Welland Canal running right down the middle of it. And with that canal, we've become somewhat of an anomaly to be a very strategic trade corridor. We are a hub for one of Canada's most robust trade corridors because of the multimodal network that we've established here. That and the anchor to that, no pun intended, is the Welland Canal. And as we've become stronger and our partnerships have grown, and therefore our economy has grown with many people that have been now a part of that partnership, not just in Niagara, but all of Southern Ontario, including Hamilton, such as one of our biggest partners is the Hamilton Oshawa Port Authority, who's now moved into Niagara because they've maxed out of land availability in Hamilton. Working with Monroe Airport, working with Rungling Airport, working with the Niagara District Airport, working with Pearson, working with Niagara Falls, New York, and Buffalo airports, working with CP and CN Rail, both short line and mainline and short line, working with Geo, with our short line operator, and of course working with the partners that are water related, but also land related, working with the BMI Group, who have become a major investor within the Thorold Multimodal Hub as part of the Niagara Trade Corridor, as well as working with the Peace Bridge, which is the second largest in North America, the second largest crossing in the town of Fort Erie, and now including them within the overall trade corridor strategy. You know, Niagara is where road meets water, rail, and air, and it's a strategic location within a one-day's drive of over 44% of North America's annual income. So my point to all that is, one, how important it is, as sometimes, most times, if not all times, the Conservatives fail to do, is to work together, is to ensure that we work together on the establishment of a plan, of a strategy. And then second to that, that we work together to implement and execute that strategy. Thirdly is to recognize where those happen, where those strategic locations are. And we have to recognize the connections between reliable transportation structures and, of course, national supply chain stability to begin the efforts to formally recognize and integrate how factors such as water, rail, and road linkages affect travel, moving people, like we're embarking on with the planning of high-frequency rail, dedicating a track to move people and a track to move commerce, trade. But as well, the way we do business domestically and around the world. So it's not just here in Canada. We also have to take into consideration having those same discussions in partnership with our binational partners on the U.S. side to then integrate our supply chains more effectively by utilizing the transportation networks that we have and, quite frankly, that we can strengthen through the process of proper planning. And an example of this network in action is the strategically located Asia-Pacific trade corridor, but as well as I mentioned earlier, the Niagara Ports trade corridor and other strategic locations that we have across the country. So, having worked tirelessly with binational transportation partners since the early 2000s, 2001 of my former life as a mayor, I recognized and continue to recognize the need to work toward an up-to-date integrated transportation network and networks across the country. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why I ran in 2015, because I ran out of the capacity at the local level to do that. And then being at the federal level, it's given me the opportunity now to expand that network, again, no pun intended, with our partners at the local level, having that experience and working at that level, but also at the provincial, the federal, and once again with the private sector. So I think it's incumbent, Mr. Chairman, that yes, we can embark on the amendment that Mr. Barclay-Debelle brings forward. But we also recognize that there's many efforts being led by this government that will, in fact, work toward exactly what ultimately we're talking about today. And to recognize, and I'll quote David Emerson from the CTA report back in 2015, to recognize the need to bring up to date, to strengthen a transportation system to ensure that Canada's overall global performance is strengthened by having that network, working with all the partners, but having that network be brought up to date, be integrated in a multimodal fashion, but as well be driven by those regional hubs where manufacturing and production is happening, and quite frankly, which makes up our supply chains. That, in fact, is your official plan. In comparison to a community being built out. And of course, the secondary plan to that is the transportation network that would add the capacity for it to run with fluidity, whether it's moving trade or commerce or trade or people, and of course be streamlined within its logistics distribution, as well as the data and digitalization that's expected to make it run even more effectively and as well more in tune with the needs of those that we're actually servicing, which is our residents as well as our business networks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Next, we have Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also support this study going forward as amended. And I think what we've heard so far this morning, this afternoon, is how important road, bridge, and highway infrastructure is to community members right across the country. And so I would ask all members to take the approach to this hearing that we're agreeing on, that this is a serious matter where we are aiming to have a constructive outcome of this session. And so what I would ask also is that members, such as the opening diatribe against our environment minister, not be part of the discussion, that we not have the repeated name calling using repeated adjectives of our environment minister, that we not have the feigned outrage that we heard in the opening remarks of Mr. Straw, and that we recognize that the massive investments that our government has put into road, highways, and bridge infrastructure, as laid out by Mr. Biddle and Mr. Badaway, is actually a very substantive investment in infrastructure across the country, urban, rural, suburban, and remote areas alike. And I will just lastly mention that as someone who was in the chamber for the entire 10 years of Mr. Harper's government, I am very aware that in the last 3 years of the Conservative government, the budget for infrastructure was cut to a mere $500 million a year for each of the last 3 years. 500 million may sound like a lot of money to those watching these proceedings, but you have heard about the billions and billions that our government has invested to support Canadians with their road, highway, and bridge infrastructure. So I'll just put that 500 million in the 2012, 13, and 2014 budgets by the previous Conservative government into perspective. $500 million is the total funding for one SkyTrain line extension from Cambie Street to the airport. That one investment that was made by former Prime Minister Martin was a $500 million investment. Prime Minister Harper allocated $500 million for all infrastructure, including housing, right across the country from end to end, from top to bottom, 3 years in a row. And so that huge deficit of infrastructure, mind you, it was maybe made up for in the public's perception by a liberal investment in signage that suggested that the Conservative Economic Action Plan is working here in your community. That signage was in place of actual investment, leaving a major deficit of infrastructure investment, which our government has been filling since we were elected in 2015. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of that corporate memory, that history from someone who was elected in 2008 and has seen and watched the various investments of previous conservative governments shrivel to almost nothing, and then the investments in road, bridge, and the highway, as well as housing and other forms of infrastructure, bloom under the current Liberal government under our Prime Minister. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Murray. Yes, Mr. Strahl.
I know we are approaching we're 15 minutes from the end of the scheduled time. I just wanted to verify with you. I understand that there are resources available to extend this meeting to 3 o'clock Eastern, and that we don't intend to give our implied consent for an adjournment unless we can come to an agreement on a motion here before the time it was scheduled to expire. So I just wanted to clarify. I understand we do have additional resources to extend the meeting if we're unable to come to an agreement on a motion here in the next 15 minutes.
You beat me to it, Mr. Strahl. I was about to inform members that the clerk has secured resources for an additional 30 minutes, and if we see that we need more, we will continuously adjust. But we do have resources until 1:30 for the time being. We'll let the discussion move forward, and if we need it, I will make adjustments as required. Next, we have Mr. Biddle, followed by Mr. Strahl, followed by Mr. Muse. So, Mr. Biddle, the floor is yours.
I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Biddle. We'll go to Mr. Strahl, followed by Mr. Muse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Mr. Barcelou-Duval's comments, and I realize I can't, as the mover of the original motion, I understand I probably can't amend his amendment. However, I will speak to his amendment, and perhaps another member can formalize some of my remarks. I think to have a 106.4 meeting means that we've agreed, and certainly the signatories of the letter, including all of the Conservative members, the Bloc member, and the NDP member on this committee, have agreed that this is a matter that deserved an emergency meeting outside of our normal meeting time. So I think that in keeping with that, I can agree with Mr. Barcelou-Duval that we can limit the to remove the Minister of Finance and the CEO of the Infrastructure Bank and other witnesses. We can drop that second half of the motion and keep it to Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, and Transport. Those three ministers, I think, would have the most relevant testimony to give to us. I do, however, think that 30 days is no longer considering it an emergent issue. We're going to have provincial budgets, et cetera, that are coming forward very soon. Same with the federal budget. We would anticipate would be sometime. We only have one sitting week in March. I suspect we all would have that as a target date for a potential budget. However, so 30 days, I think, is too long of a time to allow for this to be scheduled. I think 2 weeks, 14 days would be much more reasonable for something that the majority of us have agreed is an emergency, is an emergent issue. So, and I also think we should give each of these ministers some time on their own to answer that perhaps it would be a 3-hour meeting with ministers each appearing for 1 hour. So that would be my suggestion in response to Mr. Barcelou-Duval's. We want to work together here to come up with this. And again, this is not designed to take place of our regular Tuesday and Thursday meetings, which occur between 11 and 1. Those will continue, and we should be able to find a 3-hour time slot at least to discuss this matter prior to in the next 2 weeks. And I think that's a reasonable compromise, and one that we can continue with our current work, which I know Mr. Barcelou-Duval and Mr. Bachrach have indicated as a priority. It shouldn't be that hard to find another time slot to have a meeting with those other ministers. But those are just my comments. I know I can't actually amend his amendment to my motion, but those are my comments on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Moving through the list, Mr. Muse, is that a legacy hand, or are you willing to wishing?
That is a current hand.
Okay, Mr. Muse, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So to pick up on the comments from my colleague, Mr. Strahl, as well as the comments raised by Mr. Bachrach and Mr. Barcelou-Duval, that certainly there are contradictions and questions that have arisen as a result of the Minister of the Environment's comments. I think there is a consensus that there is a need for the minister and ministers to come and speak before this committee. And so I would suggest a sub-amendment, because as Mr. Strahl has indicated, this is an urgent issue. That's why we're having an emergency meeting. Within 14 days is quite reasonable, given the fact that this has already festered for 8 or 9 days since the comments were made. So that we're already approaching that 30-day mark when you add that in. So let me suggest as a sub-amendment to Mr. Barcelou-Duval's amendment that we change 30 days to 14 days, and that we add for 1 hour each separately. So the amendment would then read: the committee undertake a meeting of infrastructure in Canada and invite the following witnesses to appear before the committee within 14 days of this motion being adopted. for 1 hour each separately. A, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. B, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. And C, the Minister of Transport. And that the committee seek additional resources, if necessary, to accommodate these appearances. So I'll propose that and turn over the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Muse. I was just looking over in the direction of Mr. Barcelou-Duval to see if he wanted to perhaps speak to that. À vous la parole, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Merci, Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I would like to see what my colleagues think about Mr. Muse's sub-amendment proposal. I'm not saying I'm not close to it. I'm open to it. But in practical sense, is it doable? Is it feasible? I will be looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say. But I was suggesting that we have one meeting with the three ministers, the Minister of Environment, who uttered the remarks, of course, and the other two ministers who would come in terms of the financing of road projects. Now, of course, this meeting, whether we do it outside our usual scope of study items, it might be a good idea. I don't really have an issue with that. 14 days instead of 30. Well, I think is it in practical sense feasible? Because I don't know what the ministers' agendas are like, whether it can be organized. But of course, the issue is of urgency. It's an urgent issue. So going from 30 days to 14, I'm open to it. Will we do 2 hours, 3 hours? Well, I'm open to have a discussion. I'm ready to work with whatever might achieve us a consensus with the members of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Donc, j'ai personne.
I don't have anyone else on the list, so we can vote on Mr. Muse's sub-amendment to begin with. And for that,
on the sub-amendment, Monsieur Badawi?
No.
Monsieur Iacono? Monsieur Iacono?
It's Mr. Biddle. I think that's on for...
No, because...
Mr. Iacono, if you are online, you're going to have to log off for Mr. Biddle to be able to vote.
No.
Okay.
So he's voting. Okay.
Madame Koutrakis?
No.
Miss Murray?
No.
Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Straw?
Yes.
Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Miss Landsman?
Yes.
Monsieur Gourde?
Oui.
Monsieur Barsalou-Duval?
Oui.
Mr.
And
Backrack?
Mr. Backrack, yes.
Six yeas, 5 nays.
So the sub-amendment passes. We will now go to the vote on the amendment as amended by Mr. Muse. And for that, I will turn it over to our clerk.
Monsieur Badawi?
No.
Monsieur Iacono?
No.
Madame Koutrakis?
Oui.
Okay. Miss Murray?
Nope.
Mr. Rogers?
No.
Is everybody clear on what we're voting on? I don't even know.
Just for a reminder, you're voting on the amendment sub-amended by Mr. Muse.
I'm starting to see some confusion. So we're voting on the amendment put forward by Mr. Barcelou Duval that was amended by Mr. Muse.
Yes.
Okay. Just hands up. Is anybody confused online? I'm seeing heads doing this. I'm seeing Mr. Barcelou Duval kind of giving me the evil.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may.
That was confusing, Chair.
Yeah, I thought we were actually voting on the main motion.
We'll start over. We are voting. Do you want to? Can you reread the sub amendment the amendment as amended by Mr. Muse, so everybody knows what we're voting on, Madam Clerk?
So you're voting on the amendment sub-amended by Mr. Muse. So the amendment is the one proposed by Mr. Barcelou Duval. So instead of having 30 days, you have 14 days.
Are there any questions, members joining us online?
Mr. Chair, I think there is a process when a vote is called that to stop it halfway through because some members are confused. You were very clear on what was happening. I realize there might have been some confusion of members, but when this happens in the House or at a committee, members are required to get unanimous consent to change their vote. So, I would hate to get into a precedent here. I think that it likely is out of order to start a vote again halfway through. We knew what we were voting on our side. I don't want to. I just want to make it clear that this is highly irregular to stop a vote halfway through to allow members to start again.
I agree, Mr. Strahl. I just received messages from people saying, can you please read out what we are voting on, which I will take full responsibility for not doing. There was some confusion there, which is why I stopped it. So I've asked the clerk to read it out for everybody so that everybody's on the same page, including the person who proposed the amendment itself, who wanted to make sure we knew exactly what we were voting on. So I'm not going
to fight you on it, Mr. Chair. I just think it is highly irregular to stop a vote halfway through and start over.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Strahl.
Go for it.
Thank you. Exactly what's going on. Okay. Sorry, Madam Clerk. I'll let you proceed and make sure that everybody knows what's going on.
Okay.
Excuse-moi, Xavier.
So I asked Mr. Rogers, and now I'm going to Mr. Strahl.
Yes.
Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Ms. Lantzmann?
Yes.
Monsieur Gourde?
Oui.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval?
Oui.
Mr. Backrack?
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Okay, so the amendment as amended by Mr. Muse passes. Now we will go to a vote on the motion as amended. And for that, I'll turn it over to you, Madam Clerk. Does anybody need the motion as amended to be read back?
Yes, if I can read it back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Madam Clerk.
Okay, the motion is read as below, that the committee undertake a meeting on infrastructure in Canada and invite the following witnesses to appear before the committee within 14 days on this motion being adopted. A, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. B, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. C, the Minister of Transport.
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Strahl.
I believe if Mr. Muse's motion made it clear that there was 1 hour each for those ministers separately. That was a clear part of his of his motion, and I didn't hear that in the clerk's reading of the sub-amendment that we adopted.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. We're going to suspend for 2 minutes as the clerk compiles all the information and make sure that she's got everything 100%. So the meeting will be suspended for about 2 minutes. Once again, read the final motion as amended.
Yes. So the motion is read as follows: that the committee undertake a meeting on infrastructure in Canada and invite the following witnesses to appear before the committee within 14 on this motion being adopted for 1 hour each separately. A, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. B, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. C, the Minister of Transport. En français, que le comité entreprend une réunion sur l'infrastructure au Canada et invite les...
That the committee undertake a meeting on infrastructure in Canada and invite the following witnesses to appear before the committee within 14 days of this motion being adopted for 1 hour each separately. A, the Minister of Environment. B, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. And C, the Minister of Transport.
And point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Strahl, you were the first one I wanted to go to. So,
no, I believe again there was the sub-amendment did talk about additional resources as well to ensure that this was able to happen outside of the normal hours of sitting. So I'm not sure if Mr. Muse needs to send that or if we can just add that right now, but that was part of the sub-amendment.
Nodding in agreement, so I'll turn it over to the clerk on this one.
All right.
And yes, there was a second part which has been added, which was adopted, and the committee seek additional resources if necessary to accommodate these appearances. It has been adopted on this way. I can confirm you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. Badaway, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question with respect to resources. So this is now going to go outside our regular time slot. The question is going to be asked of the House if the resources are available. What if they come back and they say the resources are not available? Are we then going to proceed to have this jump the queue with respect to the studies that we have in the queue presently?
I think that's debate, Mr. Chair, and we're in the voting stage.
So we'll answer that.
Actually, Mr. Chair, if I may,
it's Mr. Bennett.
okay. Well, frankly, my vote would determine on that. That's why I'm asking the question. I need clarification on that.
The response to your question, Mr. Badaway, is that normally these requests are accepted. The vast majority of the times they are accepted. However, a formal request would have to be made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. And now I'll turn it over to the clerk. If all members are in agreement and fully comprehend the wording and are copacetic with the wording of the final amended motion, I will now move forward with the vote. I see no opposition. I'll turn it over to you, Madam Clerk.
Sure. Mr. Badaway?
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono?
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis?
Oui.
Miss Murray?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Stroll?
Yes.
Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Miss Landsman?
Yes.
Miss Landsman, I could not hear your vote.
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. Monsieur Gourde?
Oui.
Monsieur Bersalou-Duval?
Il y a toujours un élément que j'ai pas compris là. Non.
So there's something that I haven't been able to understand.
Pouvez-vous répéter votre vote?
Can you repeat your vote, please? Yes.
Mr. Backrack?
Yes.
11 yeas, 0 nays.
The motion as amended is carried. And with that, colleagues, this meeting stands adjourned.